Spring in the Thuringian hills was a thin, suspicious thing that year, a cold breath between winter and warmth. On the morning General George S. Patton rode into that gray dawn, the air tasted of iron and wet earth. Mist lay low in the hollows. Fields were churned to mud by tanks and long columns of vehicles. A raw wind carried the sharp metallic tang of recent shelling. Where the road dropped toward the town, the forest ended abruptly as if someone with a giant hand had sliced it back from the horizon. Beyond, the ground sloped to a cluster of low buildings and long, primitive barracks, which, until a few days before, would have looked like any other ramshackle labor camp to an untrained eye. But the smell. The smell was not like anything Patton had been trained for. He had known the stink of battlefields and burned towns, the acidic reek of fuel and cordite, even the greasy rot of engines and machine oil. This smell was different, a dense, clinging human smell, sour and coppery, layered with smoke from innumerable small fires, with the bitter undertone of decayed cloth and unwashed bodies. It seemed to wrap around his nose and throat, reach back into his mind and pull memory after memory of all the worst things men could do to one another. Patton sat tall in the jeep, leather collar up against the wind. He was a man of action, blunt, impatient, and famously certain of the power of force. But in that moment, in front of that low fence and watchtower, he felt something older and darker than anger, a cold, clean clarity that sharpened his instinct into something close to moral outrage. He had seen atrocities in war, but this was not trench slaughter or the collateral ruin of bombardment. This was organized, systematic, intimate cruelty, laid out in rows and piles and in the hollow eyes of the living. His face, already crisscrossed with lines from years of sun and command, closed into a look that officers around him would later describe as a kind of rock-steady fury. He looked at the soldiers flanking him, young men who hadn't yet lost their hunger for a future, who had done their duty and shouldered their fear. He looked at the townspeople peering through shutters, at German laborers shoved forward by local functionaries, and he thought, with that hard clarity, of responsibility. It had to be seen, it had to be known, it had to be impossible to deny. On the morning of April 4th, 1945, troops of the 3rd United States Army stumbled on a cluster of long, crude barracks in a clearing near Ohrdruf, a subcamp of the larger Buchenwald complex. What they found there was not an accident of war, it was the end product of policy. Rows of emaciated figures lay on pallets. Piles of clothing and shoes stood like obscene monuments. Mass graves were still half open. Survivors shuffled in and out of a daze. Guard towers loomed. The commandant's offices, hastily abandoned, still contained paperwork and petty records that read like barbaric bookkeeping. The evidence was everywhere, hideous in its ordinariness. News spread fast. Patton, who had been pressing his columns hard through Germany, was summoned because the discovery could not be ignored. He rode in with a lean staff and with a dangerous, watchful curiosity that had marked him in other crises. He wanted facts, and he wanted witnesses. He did not want history to be written later by those who would claim ignorance. What exactly Patton made people do that day, and in the drab days that followed, has become part fact and part legend, braided together in the way stories are after trauma. The core, however, is simple and stark. He insisted that German civilians, service personnel, local officials, and even Axis prisoners of war be brought to the camp and made to see what had been done in what they called their name. He ordered trucks to fetch people from nearby towns and villages. He directed that local officers and party officials be compelled, under guard, to walk the perimeter, to move among the survivors, to stand by the piles of clothing and bones, and to hear from American liberators what the evidence meant. Patton's motive was not petty vengeance. It was a deliberate, strategic decision: make the atrocities undeniable to the German populace before any narrative of denial could take root. He was a man of blunt instruments. Now he used the shock of truth as one. He wanted these people to carry that fact back to their families and neighbors, to the men who had served in the Wehrmacht and the women who had kept households, to those who had been unable or unwilling to confront what had been happening in their midst. If silence had been a shield, Patton resolved to shatter it. The scene was ugly and terrible in ways that words only partly hold. Civilians arrived in small clusters, faces gray with unease, mouths that stopped trying to form explanations. Some tried to avert their eyes, others forced themselves closer as if they could bargain with evidence by looking. A local official, put in the center of a small ring of American officers, attempted to say something about not knowing. A woman, perhaps his wife, reached blindly for a hand that wouldn't take hers. Young soldiers, still boys by outward counting, had their faces set with the hard blankness of those who have buried their fear. Patton watched them, and when he saw the first whisper of denial that could be the first step to forgetfulness, he would not allow it. He ushered groups along a precise route, first past the long rows of barracks where the living still lay in gaunt lines, then to the heaps of discarded hair, shoes, and clothing, then to the open pits that would, in years to come, be the subject of historians' measurements. There were survivors who could stand and who tried to speak. Their voices, when they came, were thin and full of the shock of disbelief. They told, not with neat chronology, but with the ragged urgency of memory, of starvation, forced labor, the casual, everyday violence of guards. They pointed to places where brutality had been routine, to spots where people had simply collapsed from lack of food. Some Germans covered their mouths and sobbed, others steeled themselves. Patton's order that local civilians and representatives see the camp was accompanied by a command that the scenes be documented, photographs, lists, official reports. He understood that the war was also about proof. Later, as journalists circulated the images and as Allied commanders prepared to shape the post-war story, the photographs from Ohrdruf would become a central part of the case. They would preclude facile denials and would be used in trials that tried to anchor guilt in sight and record. There are moments when the moral weight of an action becomes the measure by which history judges a person. Patton, who in life was sometimes caricatured as a warrior poet of force, here stepped into a role that conflated command with moral urgency. He could have ordered retribution, that the Germans be beaten or publicly humiliated as vengeance. He chose instead to make the German people witness the truth. In a perverse logic of pedagogy, he believed that seeing would make it impossible to lie. He was not inclined to gentle reconciliation. He was inclined to unvarnished exposure. The consequences were immediate and messy. Some of those German civilians returned home, carrying in their eyes the resistance of shock and the slow hardening of knowledge. They told, and some refused to believe. Rumors fought with evidence in the marketplace. Local officials who had once been pillars of authority were now known to those who had been there as complicit or, at a minimum, willfully ignorant. For American soldiers, the act of forcing the local populace to see the camp was also a release. Many veterans later wrote that it felt like doing justice by simply ensuring that the truth no longer remained hidden. But there was also a moral awkwardness that history has not been able to cleanly explain away. The Americans were liberators. They were also enforcers. The forced viewing of atrocities raised questions about dignity and the ethics of public humiliation. Men who had been part of an exploited or oppressed populace were made to look at the worst of their compatriots' policies. Some argued that no lesson could be drawn from humiliation, and that coercion could only inflame resentment. Others insisted that in a case as stark as systematic extermination and cruelty, urgency trumped nuance. Patton, who had always been a man of urgent decisions, made his choice. In the months that followed, as the camps were catalogued and survivors moved to greater safety, the images and testimonies from Ohrdruf were used as pieces in a larger mosaic. High-ranking Allied commanders visited. Orders were given that no one in the West should later say they did not know. Statements were drafted to prevent the erasure of this knowledge. Trials would follow where documentation was essential. And among the many voices, survivors, liberators, minor officials, and simple bystanders, a new, painful narrative took shape, one in which the bulk of ordinary society might be judged not only by direct action, but by the depth of its knowledge and the readiness or failure to act. Patton's decision to bring witnesses, to force citizens to confront the camp, was not theatrical revenge. It was an act born of a conviction that truth, once seen, becomes a bulwark against silence. The moral calculus he applied was rough. It depended on pain as a teacher. But if history measured morality as well as cruelty, that day near Ohrdruf marked a clear line. The camp could no longer be a rumor or a shadow. It was a visible fact placed in the sight of those who lived within the nation that had, by policy and neglect, let such places exist. In private, Patton wrote later about the taste of that day, how the smell of the camp sat in the throat like a rebuke. He reported in terse, impatient notes the faces of the men he uplifted and the shame he hoped would take root. Yet even he understood that a single sight, no matter how shocking, could not change a whole people overnight. What he did was to force open the window in a house that many had locked shut. He placed evidence against the walls, pulled back the curtain, and said plainly, "See." That insistence to record, to make eyewitnesses, to place truth where it could not be removed, became one of the early contested acts of the post-war reckoning. The camp at Ohrdruf would be dismantled, its survivors aided and taken to safety, and the evidence would be used in tribunals. But the larger work, the slow labor of justice, of memory, of rebuilding moral grammar, would take generations. Patton's role was in that instant to convert horror into a force that could not be mistaken. He did so with the blunt instrument he knew best, command. And the Thuringian wind, which had tasted of iron and smoke at dawn, carried that new fact across villages and fields. People spoke of it in whispers and in the open, refusing for some stubborn days to let the stench be forgotten. Whether Patton's method was perfect is a question history will debate, but he had, with a general certainty, made sure that the first camp found by his army would be seen, not as an accident of war, but as what it was, a deliberate, human crime that demanded response, culpability, and the hard work of remembering.